So if our last study, and you may be able to remember, our last study was really looking at that time in the life of Reuben and Gad, and actually times in our life when the Word of God or when an appropriate rebuke identifies a need for us to change. And that's what our last study was about. This study is all about what happens next. And we're going to be tracing that through both in this study and in study 4 as well. And what Numbers 32 is going to teach us tonight is what it takes to make a change. It's going to teach us how to make a change or how to make a difference in ecclesial life and other such things. And it's going to be a fascinating study looking at, and we're going to be led by really the words of Moses through Numbers 32. Now, Numbers 32 doesn't really present the formula for change. That's not how spiritual change works, as I'm sure you know. But in its details, as well as the theme of the chapter, there's going to be a number of reminders about spiritual change and what spiritual change involves. And we're going to pick those up as we go through. Now, we left Reuben and Gad figuratively wiping their brow after the verbal spray that Moses gives them in Numbers 32. And that verbal spray we have in verse 6 to verse 15 of Numbers 32. And there'll be no doubt that this tirade from Moses would have been hard to take for these two tribes. He really lacerates their request. He gets to the heart of their motivation. And as you read through, it's very emotive language, and you can almost feel Reuben and Gad squirming as they face that rebuke of this old man. And that's all well and good, brothers and sisters, but think of the environment that Reuben and Gad grew up in. And we touched on this in our last study to some extent. But think of, they had fathers like Dathan and Abiram. These were the leaders of Reuben. These were essentially the people that through the wilderness had led the tribe of Reuben. And most of us probably can appreciate how quickly personality conflicts can take a life of their own within and throughout families. And among the previous leaders of Reuben, Dathan and Abiram, Moses' name was absolutely a subject of derision. And we know that from Numbers 16. Numbers 16 is that rebellion of Korah, Dathan and Abiram. It's very obvious what the leaders of Reuben thought of Moses. So imagine then what it takes for the new leaders, but the sons of the parents of those who faced Moses in Numbers 16. Imagine what it was like for them to swallow Moses' rebuke in verse 6 to 15. Arguably, this type of rebuke from this type of man to these tribes would have been incredibly difficult to take. And then add on to this, as we saw in our last class, Reuben and Gad were of high social standing. We know Reuben was naturally the firstborn. Gad was the firstborn of the handmaid children. And so there's some social status attached to the tribes of Reuben and Gad. And as we saw last time, they were not just firstborn by birth, but they had very much cattle. They had, in essence, the highest net worth of all the tribes in the nation of Israel. They were rich, they were industrious, they were driven. You see, brothers and sisters, there's at the end of verse 15, there's reputation at stake here. There's potential for a fair whack of pride to drive Reuben and Gad's response. Now, it's not clear when we come to Numbers 32, verse 15 and 16. It's not clear, but I would suggest there is a time gap between verse 15 and verse 16. And the coming near in verse 16 is a new time period, maybe some days, maybe some weeks or months. We're unsure. And I've had a few people ask me about this after my studies, which has been fantastic. And the reason The reason for this is multifaceted. So I don't subscribe to the view that Moses misunderstood their request that they came to him with in verse 4 and 5. Meaning that verse 16 to 19 was their intended response all along. Which meant that actually there was no time gap between verse 15 and 16, because that's what they're intending to say to Moses all along. I do believe there is a time gap between verse 15 and 16. And we looked at this in our last study. You see, going east for material reasons is not something that the Bible portrays in a very good light. And we had a number of examples on the worksheet which you may have seen last time. There's Lot, there's Naomi, there's a multitude of others that go east for material reasons, and never in the Bible is it portrayed in a good light. And add on to this the fact that they asked, as we saw in verse 5, bring us not over Jordan. And these specific words indicate a spiritual immaturity from Reuben and Gad at least. And the other reason why I'm reading into the attitude of Reuben and Gad in verse 5 is because in the New Testament, our Lord actually goes to the east of Jordan during his ministry. It's called the Perean ministry. And he goes there and he spends a few months on the east of Jordan. And it's interesting that by far and away the most common issue that he addresses when he's on the east of Jordan in his ministry is covetousness. He talks about it over and over and over again, this attraction to wealth. And think of the parables he talks about. He talks about the rich man and Lazarus on the east of Jordan. He talks about the rich young ruler, which we looked at in Matthew 19. Think of the unjust steward, and there's many others, and all these occurred on the east of Jordan. I think our Lord has Numbers 32 partly in mind when he's focusing on his ministry on the east of Jordan, and over again he talks about covetousness. So there's some thoughts in terms of the gap between verse 15 and 16. But let's go on in Numbers 32 to verse 16, and we read, and they came near unto him. They came near to him. And it's interesting that here in verse 16 there's no more mention of Eliezer as there was at the start of the chapter. There's no more mention of the other heads of the tribes. There's intimacy here. There's humility here. This is a heart-to-heart with a wise old brother. And in this moment, brothers and sisters, as we looked at last time, based on Moses' arguments in verse 6 to 15, it's at this moment, as they came near to him, that national crisis has been averted. Firstly, through the spiritual vision of Moses, but then through the response and the attitude of Reuben and Gad in verse 16. And brothers and sisters, this attitude is completely different to their fathers. Look at what their fathers did. So this is talking, as we said, Numbers 16 is that rebellion of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. So this is talking about the fathers of Reuben, Dathan and Abiram. Then Moses sent for Dathan and Abiram, but they said, we will not come. So their fathers said, we will not come. In verse 16, Reuben and Gad, they came near to Moses. There's a completely different attitude here with the new leaders of Reuben and Gad in Numbers 32 and the old in Numbers 16 and verse 12. And really, the whole chapter, Numbers 32, and the story of the 2.5 tribes hinges on this simple action. They came near to him. I mean, look at the difference between those that came near to Moses and those that didn't. Those that didn't were Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, and there's a huge gulf, literally almost, between those that came near to Moses and those that didn't. And there's this This difference stems from this seemingly minor act in verse 16 where they come near unto him. And here's our first reminder, if you will, about spiritual change. And I think the simple point that we can take from the fact that Reuben and Gad came near unto Moses after they had been essentially humiliated by his outburst in verse 6 to verse 15, is that spiritual change, nothing's going to change if we push God away. And as Dad Emerson said in the Sunday morning exhort, are we willing to humble ourselves before our God? And we're not going to go into this topic of pride and humility. We looked at that on Sunday morning. But the paradox is, brothers and sisters, and this is what Reuben and Gad will teach us, is that spiritual vigour starts just after we get on our knees. And in verse 16, Reuben and Gad say some of the hardest words to say. I was wrong. And brothers and sisters, I find this hard enough to say to my best friend. Imagine what it would have been like for Reuben and Gad to say this to someone who their parents rarely saw eye to eye with. There's incredible courage and humility that's getting shown here in verse 16 by Reuben and Gad. But I want to look a little bit deeper at verse 16, and especially what verse 16 tells us about being a prophet. Geordie's been looking at prophets in his current Bible class series, and last time we looked at the important role that prophets play in ecclesial life. And why that's relevant here is because in Numbers 32, Moses is portrayed as a prophet. Now, it's not obvious, but we can see that by comparing Deuteronomy 18 with Reuben and Gad's words in verse 31 of Numbers 32. Let's look at verse 31 of Numbers 32. Look at what Reuben and Gad say, or Gad and Reuben, as the order is in verse 31. And the children of Gad and the children of Reuben answered, saying, As Yahweh hath said unto thy servants, so will we do. And the point you want to make is Yahweh hadn't said anything. Moses had spoken. Verse 29 and verse 30, that was Moses speaking. And Gad and Reuben say, As Yahweh hath said unto thy servants, so will we do. And this is the qualification of a prophet, isn't it? Deuteronomy 18 and verse 18. I'll raise them up a prophet from among their brethren like unto thee, and I'll put my words in his mouth. This is the type of prophet that Moses was. He's a prophet that has Yahweh's words in his mouth. And Numbers 32, as we've been told by Gad and Reuben, is one of those chapters where Moses is portrayed as a prophet. He's shown himself as a type of this prophet, which of course we know is ultimately speaking of the Lord Jesus Christ. And let's focus on the attitude of Moses as a prophet in verse 16. We looked at the words last time. Let's focus now on the attitude of Moses, the prophet. And as we've got on the screen, this attitude is described in its negative form in Isaiah 65 and verse 5. This is talking about the nation of Israel. God's talking about the nation of Israel, and he describes them as someone who say, keep to yourself, do not come near me, for I am too holy for you. And God says of these type of people, these are a smoke in my nostrils, a fire that burns all the day. And the point we're going to make, brothers and sisters, is this is not what Moses as a prophet did in Numbers 32. He doesn't stand aloof from Reuben and Gad when they come near to him. He allows them. He allows them to draw near to him. And this, as we know, is just like the Lord. Over and over and over and over again, it says through the Gospels that great multitudes, or the sick, or a leper, or whoever it was, came unto him. And in a number of those instances, Jesus heals them, but also he touches, he reaches out. There's this connection. They're coming unto him, and he's not standing aloof like those of Isaiah 65. No, he's reaching out. He is connecting with them. And this is Yahweh's prophet. Yes, he has the words of Yahweh in his mouth, but he's not standing aloof. He's not saying, well, I've got the words of Yahweh, so I'm far too holy for you. No. When they come near to him, he touches, he reaches out. And here is one of those reminders about spiritual change. You see, as Jude says, at the end of his epistle there, we can make a difference in people's lives. We can promote, we can even save. And as was mentioned in the study last Wednesday night, this is what God sent prophets for. He sent prophets to save. He sent prophets to arrest a slide. He sent prophets to reform. When there was nothing else left, God sent his prophets. And what God himself is saying throughout the Bible, and it comes out in Numbers 32, God himself says that a prophet is going to be ineffectual by standing aloof. Let's actually go to Jude, the end of Jude. And at the end of Jude, we know we have this commentary on making a difference, on saving. And there's two different approaches that are mentioned in Jude, isn't there? There is in verse 22, and of some have compassion, making a difference. And then there is in verse 23 another approach, others save with fear, pulling them out of the fire, hating even the garments spotted by the flesh. And there's these two different approaches in making a difference, in changing, in saving someone else. There's compassion, and there's pulling out of the fire, saving with fear. Now, I don't think Moses in Numbers 32 is really following verse 22. I don't think he's taking that approach of having compassion. That's not the intent that we get from verse 6 to verse 15. He's more in the class of verse 23, isn't he? Saving with fear, pulling them out of the fire, hating even the garment spotted by the flesh. And what I thought was interesting to point out, that even though there's a difference between verse 22 and 23, in verse 23, you still have to reach out. You've still got to pull. You've still got to make contact with someone. It's not standing aloof. There is that reaching out and making a connection. There is that, as we've said, connecting can make a difference. And I think it's an incredibly courageous step, isn't it? And we've seen this, no doubt, through ecclesial life. Those opportunities where someone is going, or is very close to going off the rails, actually reaching out and grabbing hold of them is a very courageous act. It's not easy to do, to reach out at that point and in this way. And there's still this connection even in verse 23. And brethren and sisters, as no doubt you've seen throughout ecclesial life, we have prophets like this. We've had prophets like this in our ecclesia, in ecclesial life. Prophets that have had a long-term relationship with their God. Prophets whose lips have been graced with the words of Yahweh. Prophets who have had the courage to reach out and grab hold, to touch. And young people, and I'm including myself here as a young person, so basically anyone under 50, not that I'm 50, but that's what I'm sort of thinking about as young people. Young people, we need prophets like this, don't we? We need prophets like this in our ecclesia. We need prophets like this in ecclesial life. These types of prophets who have the words of Yahweh in their mouth, but they don't stand aloof. And let's not forget, brothers and sisters, that when we come near to God through our Lord Jesus Christ, this prophet like Moses, this is the type of prophet, this is the type of mediator we are coming near to, not someone who stands at a distance. Okay, let's go back to Numbers 32 and keep on reading through the story. Verse 16 to 19. They came near to him, they said, "We will build sheepfolds here for our cattle and cities for our little ones, but we ourselves will go ready armed before the children of Israel until we have brought them unto their place. And our little ones shall dwell in the fenced cities because of the inhabitants of the land. We will not return unto our houses until the children of Israel have inherited every man his inheritance. For we will not inherit with them on yonder side Jordan or forward, because our inheritance is fallen to us on this side Jordan eastward." And given the context of verse 1 to verse 15, verse 16 to 19 is a phenomenal commitment for these two tribes to make, isn't it, brothers and sisters? And at this time, they probably didn't realise what they had signed up to in verse 16 to 19. They probably didn't understand that when they said that we will bring Israel into their place, they probably didn't realise that would take 7 years. 7 years, brothers and sisters, to bring Israel into their place. And at the end of those 7 years, in Joshua 22, Joshua says, "Ye have not left your brethren these many days unto this day." Unknowingly, maybe, that's what they'd signed up for in Numbers 32, verse 16 to 19. And brothers and sisters, these are words on a page, but let's stop and think about what this would have been like. Stop and imagine what this would have been like for Reuben and Gad, and as we'll see, for the half-tribe of Manasseh as well. It would have meant, of course, that lots of the normal things of family life would have been put on hold. Whether for each family it was 7 years or there was a rotation system, we're not sure, but things absolutely would have been put on hold. And as a dad, as I read verse 16 to 19, I would have found this incredibly hard. And it's not just missing your family. As a dad, it's you missing all those little milestones. The first day of school, the first steps that your child takes. These are the types of things that Reuben and Gad were saying, no, we're actually going to do this and not this. And brothers and sisters, you may well question why this was necessary. Imagine yourself as a mother running a house on the east of Jordan, hundreds of kilometres away from your husband, not knowing when he's going to return from the war. Would you not think that maybe this was a little bit unnecessary? As a young person without your dad to go to for a number of months or maybe even a number of years, would have you thought maybe we went a little bit too far in Numbers 32? But brothers and sisters, This was the sacrifice that Reuben and Gad made for the other tribes. And why? Why was this the sacrifice that they chose? Moses didn't say they had to do this. In verse 6 to 15, he doesn't say, now you've said the wrong things in verse 4 and 5, and now you've got to do. So he doesn't prescribe what they say in verse 16 to 19. It's quite extreme. So why did they choose this, and what may they be basing their decision on? And think of the options they had available to them after the tirade of verse 6 to 15, where it was really obvious that there was something they needed to fix. And as we looked at, the really obvious thing was their fascination with their cattle, the one thing that was eroding their worship. But they had multiple options available to them, not just the one that they chose in verse 16 to 19. They could have got rid of the cattle. They could have sold off the cattle. They could have offered the cattle as a huge sacrifice unto Yahweh. And then they could have gone and secured the inheritance over Jordan. And that's an option that was available to them, and it would take a lot of commendable commitment, no doubt. Remember what Jesus said to the rich young man who came to him on the east of Jordan in Matthew 19. Jesus said to him, the one thing that you've got to do is sell all your goods and give it to the poor. Reuben and Gad could have done a similar thing. Or they could have said, obviously, that, well, based on the words of Moses, this environment in Gilead is not going to be good for us. And so let's take our cattle across to the west. Let's maybe choose something with more spiritual connotations, less pastoral atmosphere. But they didn't. They stuck to the east, as they said in verse 16 to 19, and they stuck with their cattle. And I'm sure if they had said to Moses in verse 16 to 19 either of these two options, that Moses probably would have accepted them. They both have solid biblical principles behind them, and God loves to see these principles lifted up in our lives. But they chose another path. They kept their cattle and they stuck to the east. Now why? Why would they make this choice? It's obvious from Moses' diatribe in verse 6 to verse 15 that the east and their attachment with cattle they haven't got quite right. So why did they stick with it? What principles of God are they trying to lift up in their lives? Well, there's two other mentions of people taking a similar decision to what Reuben and Gad did here in verse 16 to 19. Two other examples that have happened beforehand, which maybe they had in their mind when they made their decision in verse 16 to 19. One is the event in Genesis 50, and we're not going to turn there, but in Genesis 50, the sons of Jacob, they leave Egypt, and in verse 8, Genesis 50 verse 8, it specifically says that they leave behind their little ones and their cattle, and they go all the way to the land of Canaan, and there they bury Jacob. So that's one example of people leaving their cattle and their little ones behind, and then going into the promised land for a number of weeks. That's one example. And the other one is one that had been mentioned as a principle in the law, but it hadn't obviously been acted on at the time of Numbers 32 because they weren't in the land at this time. And that is that principle of the law where all the males were called to go to Jerusalem, or actually where the tabernacle, where the temple was, at the time to celebrate the feasts. And it specifically says that they would have to leave their families and their cattle behind. And we see this for example, in Exodus 34. There's this principle in the law which Moses has established back in Exodus 34. Thrice in the year shall all your men, children appear before the Lord Yahweh, the God of Israel, for I will cast out the nations before thee and enlarge thy borders, neither shall any man desire thy land when thou shalt go up to appear before Yahweh thy God thrice in the year. And so there is this principle, a similar principle, that Reuben and Gad are picking up in verse 16 to 19, which has already been laid out in Exodus 34. And let's dig a little bit deeper into this. But we're going to do this by going not to Exodus 34, but Moses' commentary of Exodus 34 in Deuteronomy chapter 16. Deuteronomy 16 and verse 16. Where we read, 3 times in a year shall all thy males appear before Yahweh thy God in the place which he shall choose, in the feast of unleavened bread, in the feast of weeks, and in the feast of tabernacles, and they shall not appear before Yahweh empty. And so what we would have in the calendar of the nation of Israel, when they came into the land, is 3 times a year, all over the land, the males would do what Reuben and Gad did between Numbers 32 and Joshua 22. They would leave their cattle, they would leave their little ones, and they would go and appear before Yahweh. And why would they do this? What's the principle that God's trying to uplift here? What's the point behind this? Well, we'll read that in verse 17. Every man shall give as he is able, according to the blessing of Yahweh thy God, which he hath given thee. And I think the modern King James Version gives a really good translation of this verse. But each with his gift in his hand, according to the blessing of Yahweh your God, which he has given you. And what's this saying, brothers and sisters? Well, as we can see in verse 16, the feast that all the males had to appear for, being the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Weeks, and the Feast of Tabernacles, all of these align to significant stages in the agricultural year. The Feast of Tabernacles matched the harvest of the summer fruits, and the Passover and the Pentecost, they match the time of the wheat and barley harvest. And this is why in verse 17, the gift is mentioned, because these feasts are at the times of harvest. And so the gift then that every male would bring in verse 17 would be the first fruits. It would be the best of the harvest. And the abundance of the gift, or giving as he is able, as we saw in verse 17, would depend in large measure on the goodness of God. You see, the Feast of Tabernacles is around the time of the former rain. The Passover is around the time of the latter rain. And these heavenly cycles, we know, were absolutely necessary to produce fruit. And so depending on how good these were, these would largely determine the quality of the gift that every man would bring in verse 17. And so the point for the nation of Israel for these 3 times of the year is all about grateful service for God's goodness. And that's going to be elevated above everything else that's going on at that point in time. Grateful service for God's goodness is going to be elevated 3 times of the year, and everything else is going to stop. And that's what the nation is going to focus on above everything else. And that measure of service that they bring is going to be dependent on the blessings of God, which he sends in the former and latter rain. So how does this translate into what Reuben and Gad do in Numbers 32? Well, had they been blessed by God? Absolutely. Numbers 32 verse 1 says they had a very great multitude of cattle. They've been incredibly blessed by God in Numbers 32. And so what was their response to this? Well, they said, we're going to leave our cattle, we're going to leave our little ones, we're going to trust that no man will desire our land, and they're going to cross over Jordan to give a gift that was in keeping with what God had given them, a very great multitude of cattle. And because they had been given so much from God, much was expected. And so they gave 7 years of service in response to the abundant blessings that God had given them. And do you know how the men that crossed over to fight with Israel were described? Those men of Reuben and Gad in Joshua 1 that cross over? Who's the gift that Reuben and Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh send over to the nation of Israel? Well, Joshua 1 verse 14 says that they were all mighty men. They were all Gibor. They were mighty men of valor. 40,000 of them. You see, they didn't send the old. They didn't send the weak. They didn't send the slightly lame to help their brothers. They sent the very best. They sent the cream of the crop. They sent the first fruits, just as Israel was expected to do with the gift they would bring before Yahweh in Deuteronomy 16 and verse 17. You see, Reuben and Gad here are copying those beautiful principles which Moses had set up in Exodus 34 and he commentates on in Deuteronomy 16. And if we go back to Numbers 32, there's an implied acknowledgement, isn't there, in their response in verse 16 to 19. There's an acknowledgement in their response that they have understood that there was the one thing degrading their worship. And they understand that it was their cattle. Their cattle features highly in their response in verse 16 to 19. And that doesn't just come out in Numbers 32, that comes out in other commentaries on this place in Deuteronomy and Joshua as well. But with their growing spiritual maturity, they respond to Moses not by getting rid of their cattle, but by changing their perspective on their cattle. And in the words of Romans 14, that great conscience chapter, essentially what they're doing is, instead of not allowing, they are allowing and still giving God thanks. And to get there, they had to appreciate that the very great multitude of cattle was simply a gift of God, wasn't it, brothers and sisters? That's how they removed the one thing in their lives. They saw it for what it really was. They gave it the priority that it should have. They translated their wealth from a trap to a privilege. And wealth does elevate, brothers and sisters. Wealth absolutely elevates. But only in increasing the level of responsibility, the measure to give back. So instead of getting rid of their cattle and giving God thanks, Reuben and Gad here in Numbers 32, they're allowing and giving God thanks. And obviously, glory goes to God because of this. Now, you may have picked up that I've been quite taken, or I've been wrestling with this decision of Reuben and Gad in verse 16 to 19. And that's because I think, for me, it's you look at what their problem was or their issue was with cattle and being on the east. You look at Moses' words, and for me, I don't think my response would have been the response of Reuben and Gad in verse 16 to 19. I think I'd have been more in that camp of either going over to the west, to where the rest of the tribe of Israel was, or doing something about the cattle. So it's personally puzzling to me as to why they chose this approach. And the other reason why I find it puzzling is because we know the end. And the end of the story is that Reuben and Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh are the first ones to go into captivity. And you can absolutely make an argument that at the time of Chronicles, where it's recorded they went into captivity, that the River Jordan and their cattle had become that great isolator which they were worried about. And so you can kind of look at the decisions they make in Numbers 32 and think, oh, was that really the wisest choice? But what we can't escape from, brothers and sisters, is that Yahweh himself agrees with their decision in verse 16 to 19. There is no doubt at all that Yahweh agrees with their decision. And this means that my perspective may well be a little bit too simplified to put a blame on what happened hundreds of years later on this decision in Numbers 32, because Yahweh himself gives his blessing to their intention in Numbers 32, verse 16 and 19. And we know this from the title that's used of Moses in Joshua when it talks about Moses giving Reuben and Gad this inheritance. And as we can see here, the title that's used of Moses over and over and over again, specifically when it's talking about how he gave Reuben and Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh inheritance on the east, inheritance for their cattle. Over and over it calls him the servant of Yahweh. Joshua 12, Joshua 13 and Joshua 22, it calls Moses the servant of Yahweh. The servant of Yahweh made this decision. The servant of Yahweh made this decision. The servant of Yahweh made this decision in Numbers 32. And what are we being told, brothers and sisters? Well, we're being told that it's not just Moses, the man Moses, a fallible man that couldn't see the future, that couldn't see the spiritual danger. No, we're being told that it was a servant of Yahweh that made this decision. He's following the guidance of Yahweh. We've already looked at this in Numbers 32, where Moses is seen as a prophet who speaks the words of Yahweh. That's exactly what Moses is doing at the start of Numbers 32 when he agrees with the decision of Reuben and Gad. And Hebrews talks of Moses, we know, as a servant of Yahweh, and it says that he was trustworthy in all his house. So Reuben and Gad standing in the east with the cattle was not just blessed by Moses, brothers and sisters. It was blessed by the servant of Yahweh. And more than that, look at what happens in Joshua 22. You see, if keeping cattle showed they hadn't overcome their problem, why did Yahweh here, in Joshua 22 verse 8, why did he bless them with more? They were given very much cattle at the end of their 7 years of giving to the nation of Israel. Now, wouldn't this just expose Reuben and Gad to more risk? Well, no. You see, God here, through Moses in Numbers 32 and here in Joshua 22, he is condoning their choice. As Proverbs 10 verse 22 says, the blessing of Yahweh brings wealth without painful toil for it. Brothers and sisters, it's the blessing of Yahweh alone that does that. And I think we have here another powerful reminder about spiritual change. And this one absolutely is a reminder. I've heard this a number of times from this platform at least. What we can learn from Reuben and Gad in Numbers 32 is the importance, brothers and sisters, of having a spiritual model for personal, for family, for ecclesial decisions, for stands that we make, which we think are important. And as we'll see here in Numbers 32 and especially in Joshua 22, these are incredibly important, having a reason, a scriptural reason, a scriptural model behind the reasons why we do things. Now let's go back to the record in Numbers 32. What's the impact that Reuben and Gad are hoping to make on the nation by this huge sacrifice? Well, I think we have a hint in verse 17. In verse 17 it says, "But we ourselves will go ready armed before the children of Israel." And that word ready armed there literally means to be eager with excitement or enjoyment. You see, this is not just a picture of going to battle. This is a very enthusiastic soldier. This is a picture of excitement. And I think what they're trying to prove to Moses and to the other tribes of Israel is that we're doing this to try and motivate all the other tribes. That we're trying to prove that at the start of Numbers 32, that our previous attitude was just a flash in the pan. We're not going to sit back and let you decay. We're going to come over with excitement, with eager anticipation. We're going to do something that will make you sit up or stand up and get on with the work of inheriting and fighting. And brothers and sisters, it's hard to think of something greater than what Reuben and Gad signed up for in verse 16 to 19. It's hard to think of something greater to inspire someone else. If someone spending maybe up to 7 years away from their home isn't going to help you take your inheritance, what is going to, brothers and sisters? When you see someone who is there fighting the Canaanites, whose family is hundreds of kilometres away, and they're there for 7 years, would you not join in with them? Would you not come alongside with them? And I believe, brothers and sisters, that's what they're trying to do here in verse 16 to 19 as well. They're sending a message to the other tribes that they're going to be here, that we're going to be doing everything we can to encourage you to take your inheritance. And this commitment, brothers and sisters, in verse 16 to 19 is amazing. And I can imagine Moses loving this attitude. How could you not, brothers and sisters? And if I was Moses, I would probably stop right there. But Moses doesn't. This is not the end of the story, and we're going to finish that off in our next study. But it's not the end of the story. You see, Moses saw one small aspect missing in verse 16 to 19 from Reuben and Gad. You see, they hadn't fully got Moses' point in verse 6 to 15. And inspiring though their loyalty was, this one small shift was liable to bring everything to a halt. And we get that sense in verse 20 when we listen to Moses' reply, and it starts, if. Now, I'm not sure about you, brothers and sisters, but after an impressive commitment in verse 16 to 19, I'd maybe feel a little bit deflated or disconcerted if Moses said, well, if. There's no be strong and of a good courage here. There's no Yahweh be with you. There's if. There's doubt here. There's almost disbelief you could read into the record. There's a sense of grudging forgiveness of Moses in verse 20. And as you read through, you may have noticed this. It leads to this odd back and forth, this repetition in verse 25 to 32. If. And Moses is finishing off or completing a conversion process here with Reuben and Gad. This, brothers and sisters, this is a wise old brother in Numbers 32. His eyes are not dim. His natural force is not abated. He's seen 120 years of life, brothers and sisters. He's been Yahweh's servant for a good many of them. He speaks to Yahweh face to face. He's seen all the twists and turns of the way of Yahweh, all the nuances. And he knows there's something still missing in Reuben and Gad's dedication in verse 16 to 19. And all we need to do to lift this from the page is really that simple colouring exercise which we have on the worksheet in front of you. You see in verse 17, Reuben and Gad say, we're going to go ready armed before the children of Israel. And in verse 20 to 22, Moses says, no, you're not. No, you're not. You're going before Yahweh. Verse 20, you will go before Yahweh. Verse 21, you will go before Yahweh. Verse 22, you will go before Yahweh, before Yahweh, before Yahweh. No, you're not going before the children of Israel. You're going before Yahweh. And they got the point, brothers and sisters. Look at verse 27. When they repeat their words of verse 16 to 19, they don't say they're going to go before Israel anymore. No. They say, every man armed for war before Yahweh. You see, there's a difference. There's a change here in Reuben and Gad. And Moses makes that change. He emphasizes, he shows the difference. He says, no, you're not going before the children of Israel. You're going before Yahweh. You see, Moses' point in his diatribe from verse 6 to 15 is in verse 12. His whole point is that they weren't wholly following after Yahweh by saying, bring us not over Jordan. Yes, they were going to have a negative impact on the nation of Israel, but the real point was they weren't wholly following Yahweh. And this is the key thing that needs to change with Reuben and Gad. And why is this important, brothers and sisters? Why does Moses correct them on this seemingly insignificant point? What's Moses steering them away from? 1 John says that you show your love to God by how you treat your brother. Isn't that what Reuben and Gad are doing here in verse 16 to 19? Well, not quite, and we'll get to that in our next study.